The smell of cedar and beeswax has always been the scent of my soul. For 42 years that scent lived in the grain of the floorboards, the joints of the ceiling beams, and the very air of the house I built with my own 2 hands in the heart of Charleston. I am Elias Sterling, and I thought I knew what a foundation was. I thought a foundation was stone, mortar, and a lifetime of honest labor. I didn't know then that the most solid-looking foundations are often the first to crumble when the soil beneath them turns to greed. It was a Tuesday, the kind of heavy, humid South Carolina afternoon where the air feels like a wet blanket. I was in my workshop, the sanctuary behind the main house, running a fine grit sandpaper over the arm of a mahogany rocker. It was a piece for my grandson, or at least, the grandson I hoped I'd have one day. I was lost in the rhythm of the wood when the heavy oak door creaked open. I didn't even have to look up to know it was Julian. My son has a way of walking that sounds like a closing argument, sharp, decisive, and devoid of any hesitation. But there was another set of footsteps following him, lighter, clicking with the rhythmic precision of expensive stilettos. Beatrice Vane, my daughter-in-law of 8 months. "Dad, put the sandpaper down," Julian said. He didn't lead with a greeting. He didn't ask how my hip was feeling or if I wanted to grab dinner at the bistro downtown. His voice was clinical, the tone he used when he was closing a deal at Meridian Tech Group. I wiped my hands on my apron and looked at them. Julian looked every bit the new money mogul in a tailored charcoal suit that cost more than my first truck. Beatrice stood beside him, her blonde hair pulled back so tight it looked painful, her eyes scanning my workshop with the kind of disdain one might reserve for a landfill. "Something wrong, son?" I asked, my heart doing a slow, heavy thud against my ribs. "The generator acting up again?" "The house is fine, Elias," Beatrice interjected, her voice like silk wrapped around a razor blade. "In fact, it's more than fine. It's a masterpiece of historic architecture, which is exactly why Julian and I have decided it's time to maximize its potential." I looked at Julian, waiting for the punchline. He didn't blink. "We're moving in, Dad. Full time. We've already contacted the Historical Society. This place is going to be the flagship for our private entertaining. We need the space, the prestige, and we need it now." I felt a coldness spread through my limbs that had nothing to do with the air conditioning. "Moving in?" "Julian, there are 5 bedrooms. If you want the master suite, take it. I've been thinking of moving into the guest cottage anyway. It's closer to the shop. You don't understand." Julian cut me off, stepping into my personal space. The scent of his expensive cologne clashed with the honest smell of my wood shavings. "We aren't sharing the property. Beatrice is pregnant, and we're starting a new chapter. We need privacy. We need a clean slate." He reached into his pocket and pulled out a single gleaming silver key. He didn't hand it to me. He set it on my workbench, right on top of the rocker I was building for his unborn child. "You have 2 hours, Dad. I've already had the locks on the main house changed. I've hired a crew to come in at 5 o'clock to clear out the clutter. I suggest you pack what fits in your trunk and find a place to stay." The world seemed to tilt. I reached out to steady myself against the workbench, my fingers brushing the mahogany. 2 hours? "Julian, I built this house. I laid the brick. I carved the banisters. Your mother, Eleanor, she died in that bedroom. Her spirit is in these walls." "And that's exactly the problem," Beatrice said, stepping forward, her manicured finger tracing a line through the dust on a shelf. "It's a mausoleum, Elias. It smells like old age and sawdust. We're bringing in a designer from New York. We're stripping the wallpaper, gutting the kitchen, and that clutter Julian mentioned. That includes your mother's sewing room. It's going to be the nursery." I didn't know it yet, but that was the moment the man I used to be died, and the man I needed to become was born. "Julian," I whispered, my voice cracking. "Please, I have nowhere to go. My savings, most of it went into the roof repairs last year, and the business has been slow." My son looked at his watch. It was a gold Patek Philippe, a gift from Beatrice's father, a man who made his fortune in predatory lending. "That's not my concern, Dad." "You've had 40 years to plan for retirement. If you're broke, that's a failure of management, not a lack of opportunity. I'll give you a week to get your tools out of this shop, but the house is ours now. I checked the deed. Eleanor left her half to me, and you signed over your interest for tax purposes 3 years ago, remember?" I did remember. I remembered the night after the funeral, when I was drowned in grief and whiskey, and Julian had sat me down with a stack of papers, telling me he wanted to protect my assets from the government. I had trusted him. I had signed my life away because I thought a son's love was a legal bond. 2 hours, Elias. Beatrice echoed, a cruel, triumphant smirk playing on her lips. Don't make us call the sheriff. It would be so embarrassing for the neighbors to see you escorted off the property. They turned and walked out, the heavy door slamming behind them, vibrating the very foundations I had poured. I stood there in the silence, the dust motes dancing in the afternoon sun, feeling like a ghost in my own life. I packed, not because I wanted to, but because the sight of the moving truck pulling into the driveway at exactly 4:45 p.m. broke the last of my resolve. I stuffed 40 years of memories into 3 battered suitcases. I took the photos of Eleanor from the mantel, the ones where she was laughing in the garden, her hair caught in the breeze. I took my basic hand tools. Everything else, the furniture I'd spent decades crafting, the library of first editions Eleanor had collected, the very bed we'd shared I had to leave behind. As I backed my old Ford out of the driveway, I saw Julian and Beatrice standing on the porch, sipping sparkling water. They didn't wave. They didn't even look at me. They were already looking at the house, calculating the cost of tearing it apart. I spent the night in a neon-lit motel on the outskirts of the city, the kind of place where the air smells like stale cigarettes and regret. I sat on the edge of a sagging mattress, my head in my hands, wondering how I had raised a monster. My bank account held exactly $412. My business was a workshop I no longer owned. I was 68 years old and I was homeless. I reached into my pocket to find my phone, but my fingers brushed against something else, a worn, leather wallet that had belonged to Eleanor. I hadn't opened it since the day she passed. I had kept it as a relic, a piece of her I couldn't let go. With trembling hands, I opened the billfold. There was a photo of us on our honeymoon in Savannah, grinning like idiots, and tucked behind a flap of leather, there was a faded blue debit card. It didn't have a major bank logo. It just said, Stuyvesant Private Wealth, in embossed gold lettering. On the back, in Eleanor's elegant looping script, were 4 digits. 1014, our anniversary. I remembered Eleanor used to spend hours on her old laptop at the kitchen table, her reading glasses perched on the tip of her nose. I'd always teased her about her digital knitting. She'd just smile and say, I'm just tending the garden, Elias. You build the house and I'll make sure the soil stays rich. I thought she was playing solitaire or looking at quilting patterns. I didn't sleep that night. I stared at that card, wondering if there was enough on it for a week's groceries or maybe a month's rent in a cramped studio apartment. The next morning, I drove to the only Stuyvesant branch in South Carolina, a discreet, limestone building tucked away in a quiet corner of the French Quarter. I felt out of place in my flannel shirt and worn work boots as I stepped onto the polished marble floors. I approached the teller, a young man named Caleb who looked like he'd never seen a day of hard labor in his life. I'd like to check the balance on this account, I said, sliding the card across the counter. It belonged to my wife, Elias Sterling. She passed away a few years ago. Caleb took the card with a polite, practiced smile. Of course, Mr. Sterling. Let me just run the numbers. He swiped the card and began typing. I watched his face, expecting a sympathetic frown and a, I'm sorry, sir, this account is closed, or perhaps, there is a balance of $12. But Caleb's face didn't frown. It froze. His eyes widened, his fingers hovering over the keyboard as if the keys had suddenly turned red hot. He looked at the screen, then at me, then back at the screen. He swallowed hard, his Adam's apple bobbing. Is there a problem? I asked, my heart hammering. I know it's an old card, sir, Caleb whispered, his voice trembling. I need to get the managing director. Please, don't move. Just give me one moment. He didn't walk. He nearly ran toward a set of heavy mahogany doors at the back of the hall. I stood there, clutching the edge of the marble counter, my mind racing. Had Eleanor been involved in something illegal? Was I about to be arrested? A few minutes later, the doors opened. A tall, silver-haired man in a 3-piece suit emerged, walking with a sense of urgency that didn't match the quiet atmosphere of the bank. His nameplate read Harrison Montgomery, Senior Partner. Mr. Sterling, Harrison said, extending a hand that felt like warm parchment. I am so incredibly sorry we didn't reach out sooner. We had instructions to wait until the card was activated. Please, come with me. We have much to discuss. He led me into a private office that felt more like a library in an English manner. He sat me down in a leather chair and turned a computer monitor toward me. Your wife was a visionary, Elias. She began investing in the early 90s, small amounts at first, but with a clinical, almost prophetic understanding of the tech and energy sectors. She moved assets into private equity firms we manage, and she had a buy and hold strategy that most of our institutional investors would envy. He hit a key, and a series of numbers appeared on the screen. I blinked, sure my vision was failing me. The Elias Sterling Legacy Trust, Harrison announced. Current liquid assets, $48 million. Real estate holdings and diversified portfolios, an additional $32 million. I couldn't breathe. The room felt like it was spinning. $80 million? I gasped. Eleanor? My Eleanor? She left a letter for you, Elias, Harrison said, handing me a cream-colored envelope. She insisted you only receive it if you were left with nothing but the clothes on your back. Her words, not mine. I opened the letter, my tears blurring the ink. My dearest Elias, if you are reading this, then our son has done exactly what I feared he would. I saw the shadow in Julian long ago, the way he looked at your hard work, not with pride, but with a calculation of its value. I saw the way Beatrice looked at our home like it was a prize to be won, not a life to be shared. I spent 30 years building this anchor for you, my love. Not because I wanted to hide things, but because I knew you would never accept a life of luxury while your hands were still capable of work. But I also knew a day would come when those hands would be tired, and the people you loved would try to break you. Don't just survive, Elias. Use this. Protect the legacy of the Sterling name. And remember, a house is made of wood, but a kingdom is made of gold. Take back what is yours. I looked up at Harrison. The grief was still there, a dull ache in my chest, but it was being eclipsed by a new, burning sensation, a fire I hadn't felt in decades. Mr. Montgomery, I said, my voice steady for the first time since I was evicted. I want to talk about Meridian Tech Group, my son's company. Harrison leaned back, a predatory glint in his eye. A bold company, though rumor has it they're over-leveraged and looking for a massive capital injection to stay afloat. Why do you ask? Because, I said, leaning forward, I don't just want to stay at a hotel. I want to buy the debt on their building. I want to buy the land their headquarters sits on. And I want to do it by the end of the week. What happened next changed everything. I walked out of that bank not as a homeless carpenter, but as the most powerful man Julian Sterling didn't know existed. But as I reached my car, my phone buzzed. It was a text from Julian. Dad, we found Mom's old journals in the attic. We're burning the clutter tonight in the backyard fire pit. Hope you're enjoying the motel. My grip tightened on the steering wheel until my knuckles turned white. He didn't know it yet, but Julian had just started a war he couldn't afford to lose. The drive back to my old home, the home I had built, the home I had been purged from, was a blur of red lights and white-knuckled fury. I didn't care about the speed traps or the thin tread on my tires. All I could see was the image of Eleanor's journals, the private maps of her heart and mind, being turned into ash for the sake of a clean slate. As I rounded the corner of Kensington Lane, I saw the smoke rising like a black smudge against the twilight sky. It wasn't a large fire, just a controlled burn in the stone pit I had built for our family oyster roasts. But to me, it looked like a funeral pyre for my entire life. I slammed the truck into park and didn't even turn off the engine. I stumbled toward the backyard, my boots crunching on the gravel. "Julian, stop!" I screamed, my voice raw. Julian and Beatrice were sitting in Adirondack chairs, the ones I'd hand-carved from Cyprus-clinking crystal glasses of Chateauneuf-du-Pape. They looked like a couple out of a luxury travel magazine, framed by the flickering orange glow of the fire. "Ah, the prodigal father returns," Beatrice said, not even bothering to look up. She tossed a small, leather-bound book into the flames. I recognized the cover. It was the blue velvet diary Eleanor had kept during her first round of chemotherapy. "Pick that up. Julian, for God's sake, that's your mother's life." I lunged for the fire pit, but Julian stood up, blocking my path. He was younger, faster, and fueled by a cold, corporate arrogance that I couldn't match physically. "It's paper, Dad," Julian said, his voice flat. "It's clutter. It's sentimentality holding back progress. We're turning this backyard into an infinity pool and a minimalist Zen garden. There's no room for dusty books and ghost stories." "Progress?" I choked out, the smoke stinging my eyes. "You're burning the only part of her you have left." "I have her DNA, Elias. That's enough," he replied, and for the first time, I saw the true void where his soul should have been. He looked at me with a clinical detachment, as if I were a malfunctioning piece of hardware. "Now, I believe I told you that you were no longer welcome here. you're trespassing. If you don't leave in the next 60 seconds, Beatrice is already on the line with the private security firm we hired. I looked at the fire. The blue velvet was turning black, curling into itself, the ink of my wife's final words disappearing into the heat. I looked at my son, the boy I had taught to fish in the Cooper River, the young man whose tuition I had paid by taking on double shifts and weekend repairs. I didn't argue. I didn't beg. I felt a strange, icy calm settle over me. The fire in the pit was dying, but the fire in my gut was just beginning to roar. "You're right, Julian," I said, my voice dropping to a whisper that made him blink. "It is just paper, and this is just a house." I turned and walked back to my truck. I didn't look back at the smoke. I didn't look back at the silhouettes of the two people who had just finished murdering my memories. I had 80 million reasons to keep moving, and none of them involved begging for scraps of my own life. The next morning, I was back in the sanctuary of Harrison Montgomery's office at Stuyvesant Private Wealth. I hadn't slept. I had spent the night in that dingy motel, staring at the ceiling, realizing that the golden boy I thought I raised was a fiction. Julian had always been ambitious. I remember him at 10 years old, selling lemonade, but he wasn't just selling a drink. He was hiring the neighborhood kids to run the stands while he managed the logistics. I'd laughed then, proud of his spirit. I didn't see the early signs of the shark he would become. He had married Beatrice Vane because the Vane family was old money in Charleston, prestigious, connected, and decaying. Her family had the names, but they were running out of the gold to polish them. Julian provided the capital through his tech firm, and Beatrice provided the social ladder. Together, they were a parasitic power couple, and I was just the host they had finished feeding on. "Mr. Sterling," Harrison said, sliding a thick digital tablet across the desk. "I've had my team working through the night. You asked for a deep dive into Meridian Tech Group. What did you find?" I asked. Harrison leaned forward, his face illuminated by the blue light of the screen. "Your son is a very talented salesman, Elias. He's built a reputation on disrupting the logistics industry, but disruption is often a polite word for unstable. Meridian Tech has been expanding at a reckless pace. They've taken on massive private debt to fund their new headquarters, the Vane Sterling Plaza downtown." "Vane Sterling?" I scoffed. "He's already rebranding his life." "Exactly, but here's the vulnerability. The primary creditor for that project was Blackwood Holdings. They're a gritty, aggressive firm out of New York. They don't care about family names, they care about quarterly yields. And Julian, well, he's missed 2 major milestones on the project. Blackwood is looking to offload the debt. They think the project is a sinking ship." "How much?" I asked. $24 million for the primary note. If you buy it, you don't just own the debt, you become the landlord of his corporate headquarters. You become the person who holds the keys to his entire professional existence. I looked out the window at the Charleston skyline. I could see the skeletal frame of the Vane Sterling Plaza rising up, a monument to Julian's ego. "Buy it," I said. "And Harrison, I don't want my name on it. Use a shell company. Call it ES Legacy Partners. Consider it done." "But there's more," Harrison continued. I looked into Beatrice Vane's personal holdings. Her family's estate, the Willows, is in a dire state of tax arrears. They've been hiding it behind a series of trusts, but the foundation is rotting. They were counting on Julian's IPO next month to bail them out. The pieces were falling into place. They hadn't just kicked me out for space. They were preparing to sell my house, the Sterling family home, to a developer for a quick cash infusion to keep their crumbling empire afloat. They needed the clutter gone because the house was already listed on a private luxury portal. I didn't know it yet, but I wasn't just going to take my house back. I was going to take the ground they stood on. For the next 3 days, I played the part of the broken father. I stayed in the motel. I went to the local diner, letting the regulars see me looking disheveled and defeated. I knew word would get back to Julian. I wanted him to feel safe. I wanted him to think I was a spent force, a ghost lingering in the graveyard of my own life. On Thursday, I received a call from a man named Silas Blackwood. He was the head of the firm Harrison had mentioned, a man with a voice like gravel and a reputation for being the executioner of Wall Street. "Mr. Sterling," Silas said, "I hear you're the man interested in my Julian Sterling problem." "I am," I said. "I like you. You don't waste time. The paperwork is ready. We've transferred the Vane Sterling Plaza notes to ES Legacy. You are now the man. Julian owes $24 million to, and since he's in technical default of the construction timeline, you have the right to accelerate the loan." "Not yet," I said. I want to wait for the groundbreaking ceremony on Saturday. It's a big event. The governor will be there. The Vane family will be there. It's Julian's coming out party. Cold-blooded, Silas chuckled. I like it. I'll see you in the shadows, Mr. Sterling. That Friday night, I did something I hadn't done in years. I went to the workshop behind the house. Not the one Julian had stolen, but a small rented garage on the edge of the industrial district. I had bought a set of high-end tools, the kind of precision instruments I could only dream of when I was a struggling carpenter. I spent the night working on a single piece of wood, a small, perfectly polished box made of bocote, an exotic wood with dark, swirling grains that look like eyes. Inside, I placed a single item, the silver key Julian had left on my workbench the day he threw me out. I also added a small note, written on the back of the Stuyvesant Bank balance sheet. Dear Julian, you said a house is just wood and paper. You said a foundation is just stone. You're about to learn that a foundation is actually made of the people you betray. I'm not coming for my house anymore. I'm coming for everything. I had the box couriered to his office on Saturday morning, time to arrive exactly 1 hour before the groundbreaking ceremony. As I sat in my truck, watching the black SUVs line up outside the construction site of the Vane Sterling Plaza, I saw Julian and Beatrice step out. They looked like royalty. The cameras flashed. The socialites cheered. Julian took the stage, a silver shovel in his hand, ready to break ground on his new empire. But as he reached for the microphone, I saw his assistant run up to him, whispering urgently. She handed him a small, dark wooden box. I watched through a pair of binoculars from across the street. Julian opened the box. Even from 100 yards away, I could see the color drain from his face. He looked at the key. He looked at the note. He looked around the crowd, his eyes frantic, searching for the ghost he thought he'd exorcised. Then, he looked at his phone. Harrison had just sent the official notice of acceleration. E.S. Legacy Partners was demanding the full $24 million. Due immediately. What happened next changed everything. Julian didn't faint. He didn't scream. He did something much worse. He leaned over to Beatrice, whispered something that made her eyes turn into ice, and then he looked directly at the governor. Ladies and gentlemen, Julian said into the microphone, his voice trembling but loud. There has been a slight change in the schedule. We aren't just breaking ground today. We're announcing a merger. A merger that will make this debt irrelevant. I frowned. A merger? Who would merge with a company in default? I'd like to introduce our new primary partner, Julian continued. The man who is bringing $40 million in fresh capital to Meridian Tech, my father-in-law, Jax Vane. My heart stopped. Jax Vane was a ghost. A man who had been retired in the Caribbean for a decade after a series of underworld investigations. If Jax Vane was back, and he was putting $40 million into Julian's company, this wasn't just a family feud anymore. This was a war against the underworld. I didn't know it yet, but my wife hadn't just left me a fortune. She had left me a target on my back. The applause at the groundbreaking ceremony was a physical weight, pressing against the windows of my truck. I watched Jax Vane step onto the stage. He didn't look like the other old money fossils in Charleston. He was lean, dressed in a sharp, midnight blue suit that couldn't hide the predatory stillness of a man who had survived things most people only saw in nightmares. His hair was a shock of white, his skin tanned and leathery, and his eyes. Even through the binoculars, those eyes looked like two holes burned into a map. Jax Vane wasn't just Beatrice's father. He was a shadow over the Atlantic coast, a man whose name was whispered in the back rooms of shipping docks and high-end auction houses. 10 years ago, he'd vanished, fleeing a federal racketeering probe that had somehow collapsed when 3 key witnesses simply stopped existing. And now, my son was shaking his hand. My son was inviting that darkness into our family's bloodline. I watched through the glass as Julian whispered something to Beatrice, who was beaming with a terrifying, doll-like perfection. She looked at her father with a mixture of reverence and something that looked like relief. They weren't just building a plaza, they were laundering a legacy. I didn't realize it then, but I wasn't just fighting for a house anymore. I was fighting for the soul of the Sterling name. I pulled away from the curb, my mind spinning. $40 million. That capital injection would neutralize my acceleration of the debt. It would buy Julian time to finish the project, time to launch his IPO, and time to bury me under a mountain of legal fees and unfortunate accidents. I drove back to the motel, but I couldn't go inside. The walls felt like they were closing in. Instead, I drove out to the Ashley River, to a spot where Eleanor and I used to take Julian when he was just a toddler. I sat on the tailgate of my truck, watching the black water swirl under the moonlight. I started thinking back to the early warning signs, the things I'd dismissed as growing pains or youthful ambition. I remembered the summer Julian was 16. I'd given him a job at the workshop, trying to teach him the value of a clean dovetail joint. He was brilliant with his hands, but he lacked the patience for the process. "Why spend 3 days on one chair, Dad?" he'd asked, throwing a chisel onto the workbench. "I could buy 100 of these from a factory in China and sell them for 10 times the price if I just put the right label on them." "Because a label isn't a soul, Julian," I told him. "A man is only as good as the things he leaves behind." He just laughed, a sound that lacked any warmth. "A man is only as good as the leverage he has over the next man." I'd ignored it. I'd told myself he was just a product of a faster, colder generation. I'd worked harder to provide for him, thinking that if I filled his life with enough comfort, he wouldn't feel the need to hunt for it. I was wrong. By providing everything, I'd made him believe that the world owed him even more. Then there was the night he brought Beatrice home for the first time. This was 2 years after Eleanor passed. I was still a shell of a man, wandering through the big house on Kensington Lane like a ghost. Beatrice walked in and didn't look at the furniture or the photos. She looked at the molding. She looked at the square footage. "It's a lovely footprint, Elias," she'd said, her voice dripping with a condescension she barely bothered to hide. "With the right vision, this could be something truly elite. It's such a shame to see it stagnant." Julian had stood behind her, nodding like a sycophant. He'd already begun to change. His language had shifted to assets, equity, and optimization. He stopped calling me Dad and started calling me Elias in front of her friends. I thought he was just trying to fit into her world. I didn't realize he was already planning to evict me from mine. What I didn't know then was that Eleanor had seen it all coming long before I did. The next morning, I returned to Stuyvesant Wealth. I needed answers. Harrison Montgomery was waiting for me, but he wasn't alone. Sitting in his office was a woman I recognized from the society pages, Elias Sterling, my younger sister. We hadn't spoken in 5 years. She'd always been the black sheep, a sharp-tongued litigator who'd walked away from the family business to chase justice in the darker corners of the law. "Elias," she said, her voice like sandpaper on silk. "You look like hell." "Good to see you too, Bella," I sighed, sinking into a chair. "Harrison told me about the trust, and about Julian," she said, leaning forward. Her eyes were the same shade of slate as mine. "He also told me Jack's vein has crawled out from under his rock." "He's putting 40 million into Julian's company," I said. "He's bailing him out." Bella shook her head. "Jack's vein doesn't bail people out, Elias. He colonizes them. If he's putting 40 million into Meridian Tech, he's not a partner. He's the owner. Julian just hasn't figured out he's a puppet yet." Harrison cleared his throat. "There's more, Elias." I went back through Eleanor's private digital archives, the stuff she kept encrypted. She wasn't just watching stocks. She was watching the veins. He pulled up a file on his screen. It was a series of scanned documents dating back 20 years. Property records, bank transfers, and most shockingly, private investigator reports. "Eleanor knew Jack's vein back in the 80s, Bella whispered. "Before you and she were even married. They grew up in the same circles. She knew the rot in that family better than anyone." I stared at the screen. There were photos of a young Eleanor and a young Jack's vein at a debutante ball, but it was the note attached to the photo that stopped my heart. "Jax thinks he can own the city. He thinks people are just resources to be mined. He's looking at the Sterling land, the marsh acreage Elias's grandfather left us. He'll use Julian if he has to. I have to build a wall he can't climb. If Julian turns, the money must be the weapon, not the prize." My wife hadn't just been a genius investor, she had been a guardian. She had seen the intersection of Jack's veins' greed and Julian's ambition decades ago. She had built this $80 million anchor not just to save me, but to drown the people who would try to use our family. "The marsh acreage," I whispered. "The land the plaza is being built on." "Exactly," Bella said, her eyes flashing. "Julian thinks he owns it because he took the house. But the construction site, the actual dirt under that 20-story tower, it's held in a separate agricultural trust. A trust that only matures upon your death. Or upon a proven breach of familial fiduciary duty by the heir." "What does that mean in English, Bella?" "It means," she smiled, and it was a cold, terrifying sight, "that because Julian evicted you and burned Eleanor's records, He's in breach of the moral and legal clauses Eleanor wrote into the land deed. He doesn't own the dirt, Elias. He's building a $40 million monument on land that you can reclaim at any moment. I felt a surge of adrenaline so sharp it made my hands shake. I wasn't just a landlord anymore. I was the man who could pull the rug out from under the Vane family and my son's entire future. But we have to be careful, Harrison warned. Jax Vane isn't a man who respects land deeds. If you move to seize the land, he'll stop using banks and start using other methods. I don't care, I said. He burned her journals. He threw me out like trash. Let him come. Bella stood up and adjusted her blazer. I'll handle the legal filing. We'll keep it quiet for now. We want them to keep pouring Jax's money into that hole in the ground. Every brick they lay is a brick we'll eventually own. But Elias, you can't stay at that motel. It's not safe. She was right. If Jax Vane found out I was the one behind the debt purchase, and that I was sitting on $80 million, a cheap motel on the highway would be a death trap. I moved into a high-security apartment complex downtown, under the name Arthur Miller. For the next week, I lived like a spy. I watched the news. I watched the construction site from a distance. And I watched Julian. He was everywhere. Magazine covers, talk shows, charity galas. He was the king of Charleston, with Beatrice as his queen. They looked untouchable. But I began to notice something in the photos. Julian looked tired. His smiles were forced. In one paparazzi shot, he was leaving a restaurant with Beatrice and Jax. Jax had his hand on Julian's shoulder, but it didn't look like a fatherly gesture. It looked like a grip. I didn't know it yet, but Julian was starting to realize that the devil doesn't give you $40 million for free. On Wednesday, I received a package at my new apartment. There was no return address. Inside was a single charred page from one of Eleanor's journals. It must have survived the fire. The ink was faded, but the words were clear. Julian asked me today why I love the workshop so much. I told him it's because wood never lies. If you mistreat it, it cracks. If you honor it, it lasts forever. He looked at me like I was speaking a dead language. I'm afraid for him, Elias. I'm afraid he's going to break himself trying to be something he's not. Attached to the page was a sticky note in a handwriting I didn't recognize. He's already breaking. Meet me at the Admiral's pub at midnight. Come alone. I have what you need to finish this. My heart pounded. Was it a trap? Or was there someone inside Julian's inner circle who still had a conscience? I told Bella and Harrison I was staying in for the night. I didn't want them to stop me. I needed to know who was sending me pieces of my wife's soul. The Admiral's pub was a dive bar on the edge of the docks, the kind of place where the air smells like diesel and stale beer. It was the last place a Sterling would ever be seen. I sat in a dark booth in the back, my hat low over my eyes. At exactly midnight, the bell over the door chimed. A woman walked in. She was wearing a heavy trench coat and a scarf that covered most of her face. She sat down across from me without a word. She pulled back the scarf. It was Amberly, Julian's executive assistant, the woman who had handed him the box at the ceremony. "Mr. Sterling," she whispered, her eyes darting toward the door. "I don't have much time. Julian thinks I'm at the office finishing the IPO filings. Why are you here, Amberly?" "Why did you send me that page?" "Because Julian isn't in charge anymore," she said, her voice trembling. "Beatrice and her father, they've taken over the accounts. They're using Meridian Tech to move something other than software. High-value cargo is being routed through the plaza's construction logistics." "What kind of cargo?" "I don't know for sure, but Jax Vane has been meeting with men from the Blackwood underworld. They're using the IPO as a front for a massive money laundering operation. And Julian, they're setting him up to take the fall if the feds move in." I felt a cold dread settle in my stomach. Julian was a thief and a traitor, but he was my son. He was being led to the slaughter by the woman he thought he loved. "Why, tell me?" I asked. Amberly looked down at her hands. "Because your wife, Eleanor, she paid for my mother's heart surgery 10 years ago. She did it anonymously through a foundation, but I found out. She told me once to look out for Julian. She said he'd lose his way." She reached into her bag and pulled out a thumb drive. "Everything is on here, the real ledgers, the shipping manifests, the evidence that Beatrice Vane has been siphoning millions into offshore accounts since the day they got married. Does Julian know? He's starting to ask questions. That's why he's in danger." Jax Vane doesn't like questions. Suddenly, the front door of the pub swung open. 2 men in dark suits stepped inside. They didn't look like sailors. They looked like hunters. Amberly's face went white. "Oh God." They followed me. What happened next changed the stakes of the game forever. I didn't have a weapon. I didn't have a plan. All I had was a thumb drive that could destroy my son's empire and a sister who was a master of the law. "Get out the back," I hissed at Amberly. "Now!" She vanished into the shadows of the kitchen just as the two men spotted me. They started walking toward my booth, their hands reaching inside their jackets. I stood up, my heart hammering against my ribs like a trapped bird. I looked at the lead man, a scarred brute with eyes as cold as a South Carolina winter. "Elias Sterling," he said, a cruel smile spreading across his face. "Jax Vane sends his regards. He says it's time for you to stop playing ghost and start being one." I didn't know it yet, but the Carpenter from Charleston was about to show the underworld why you never underestimate a man who knows how to build things and how to tear them down. The lead man took another step toward me, his shadow stretching across the sticky floorboards like a dark stain. In his hand, the suppressed pistol looked like a toy, but the weight of the air told me otherwise. I felt the thumb drive in my pocket, a small piece of plastic that weighed as much as a mountain. It wasn't just data. It was the only thing standing between my son and a shallow grave in the low country marshes. "Give me the drive." "Elias," the man said, his voice a low, gravelly rasp. "Jax doesn't want to hurt a local legend, but he will if you make him." I looked at the bar. The bartender, a man with a face like a crumpled paper bag, didn't even look up from the glass he was drying. He'd seen this before. In the docks of Charleston, silence was the only currency that kept you alive. I didn't have a weapon, but I had 40 years of muscle memory and a lifetime of knowing how things were put together. I gripped the edge of the heavy oak table, a piece I recognized as a 1940s naval surplus build. It was solid, bolted to the floor, but the bench wasn't. "I don't know what you're talking about," I said, my voice surprisingly steady. "I'm just an old man having a drink. Don't lie to me. We saw the girl." He raised the gun. I didn't wait for him to finish. I didn't think about my hip or my age. I kicked the base of the heavy wooden bench, sending it sliding across the floor toward their shins. As they stumbled, I grabbed a heavy glass pitcher of ice water from the neighboring booth and swung it with everything I had. It shattered against the lead man's face in a spray of glass and freezing water. I didn't stay to see if he went down. I bolted for the back door, the same way Amberly had gone. I burst through the kitchen, past a startled cook and into the salt-heavy air of the alleyway. I could hear their boots pounding behind me. I didn't head for the main street. I knew these alleys. I'd helped restore half the historic buildings on this block. I ducked behind a massive industrial dumpster, climbed a rusted fire escape, and flattened myself against the brickwork of a third-story ledge. Below me, the two hunters burst into the alley. They looked around, their chests heaving, the lead man wiping blood from his cheek. They stayed for 5 minutes, whispering into their radios, before finally retreating toward a black sedan idling at the corner. I waited until my heart stopped trying to kick its way out of my chest. I took the thumb drive out and looked at it. I didn't know it then, but this small object was about to become the hammer I used to shatter my son's life so I could finally save it. The next morning, I was at a secure location, a private estate on Sullivan's Island owned by my sister, Bella. She had the drive plugged into a disconnected laptop, her face illuminated by the flickering data as she scrolled through the files Amberly had provided. "It's worse than we thought, Elias," Bella said, her voice tight with a mixture of professional fury and sisterly concern. "The Vane Sterling Plaza isn't just a construction site. It's a funnel. Jax Vane is using Julian's logistics software to bypass port security. They aren't just moving money, they're moving stolen artifacts, unregistered luxury goods, and look at this." She pointed to a spreadsheet. "This is Beatrice's personal ledger. She's been siphoning the 40 million Jax invested back into her family's private accounts in the Cayman Islands. She's literally looting her husband's company while he takes the legal risk for the smuggling." "And Julian?" I asked, pacing the room. "Is he part of the smuggling?" "According to these emails, no. He's just a fool. He thinks he's getting priority shipping contracts from his father-in-law to boost his IPO numbers. He's so blinded by the desire to be a mogul that he hasn't looked at what's actually inside the crates. My son was the perfect patsy. He had the name, the legitimate company, and the desperate ambition that made him easy to manipulate. Beatrice hadn't married him for love. She'd married him for his infrastructure." "I need to talk to him," I said. "Before Jax decides Julian is a liability. He won't listen to you, Elias. To him, you're the man who's trying to sue him for his land. You're the clutter he threw out." "Then I'll make him listen," I said, a plan forming in the back of my mind. Bella, how long until you can file the land reclamation suit? The paperwork is ready. We can serve him on Monday. Do it, I said, but do it publicly. I want every news outlet in Charleston at the Plaza groundbreaking site. I want the world to see the foundation of his empire crumble in real time. The weekend was a slow-motion nightmare. I spent it watching the news. Julian was everywhere, celebrating the final pillar of the plaza. He looked triumphant, but as the camera zoomed in during a local news interview, I saw the twitch in his jaw. I saw the way he glanced at Beatrice, who stood behind him like a guardian gargoyle. On Monday morning, the heat in Charleston was oppressive, the kind of humidity that makes the pavement sweat. I parked my truck 3 blocks away from the Evicted Sterling Plaza site and walked. I didn't wear a disguise. I wore my best work shirt and my old Stetson. I wanted him to see me. A crowd had gathered for the ceremonial unveiling of the building's lobby, a glass and steel monstrosity that looked like a jagged tooth rising out of the historic district. The Vane family was there in full force. Jax Vane standing in the center like a sun that everything else orbited. Julian was at the podium, his voice echoing through the PA system. This building represents the future of Charleston. It represents a synergy of tradition and innovation. It represents a lie, I shouted, my voice cutting through the amplified drone. The crowd went silent. Hundreds of heads turned toward me. I saw the security guards tensing, moving toward me, but Jax Vane raised a hand, stopping them. He wanted to savor this. He wanted to watch me humiliate myself. Julian's face turned a deep, mottled red. Dad, what are you doing here? I told you. I'm here to serve you, Julian, I said, walking toward the stage. Behind me, Bella appeared, followed by 3 men in dark suits, process servers, and a court representative. I'm here to tell you that you don't own the ground you're standing on. A murmur rippled through the crowd. Cameras began to flash. Beatrice stepped forward, her eyes narrowing into slits. Elias, stop this nonsense. You're making a fool of yourself. You're mentally unstable. Am I, Beatrice? Or am I the only one here who's read the 1974 Sterling Agricultural Trust? I looked at Julian, who was staring at me with a mixture of confusion and growing dread. You took the house, Julian. You took the workshop. But your mother was smarter than both of us. She knew you'd eventually fall in with the Vanes. She put the land this plaza sits on into a protected trust. A trust you just breached by committing a familial fiduciary violation. That's a lie, Julian screamed, his voice cracking. I have the deed. You have the deed to the building, son. But the soil, the 30 acres of prime waterfront real estate, that belongs to the Sterling Legacy Trust. And as of 9 o'clock this morning, the South Carolina Second Circuit Court has issued a temporary injunction. All construction stops, all assets are frozen, and I'm reclaiming the property. The silence that followed was deafening. I looked at Jax Vane. For the first time, I saw a flicker of something in his eyes. Not fear, not yet, but a cold, calculating assessment of a new threat. Elias, Jax said, his voice smooth and dangerous as he stepped to the edge of the stage. This is a very expensive mistake you're making. You're not just hurting your son. You're hurting the investors. You're hurting the city. I'm protecting the city from you, Jax, I said, looking him dead in the eye. And as for the investors, I think they'd be very interested in the files I just sent to the SEC and the FBI. Beatrice's hand went to her throat. Julian looked between me and his father-in-law, the realization finally beginning to dawn on him. He wasn't the king of the castle. He was a man standing on a trapdoor, and I had just put my hand on the lever. Security, Beatrice hissed. Get him out of here, now. The guards moved in, grabbing my arms. I didn't resist. I'd made my point. As they led me away, I looked back at Julian. He was slumped against the podium, the king of Charleston reduced to a frightened boy who had realized his throne was made of sand. But the humiliation was only the beginning. I was escorted to the edge of the property line and released. I stood on the sidewalk, watching the chaos unfold as reporters swarmed Julian and the Vanes. The groundbreaking ceremony had turned into a crime scene investigation. I walked back to my truck, but I didn't get in. A black SUV pulled up beside me, the window rolling down slowly. Jax Vane was sitting in the back seat. You're a brave man, Elias, Jax said, his voice a low growl. But you've forgotten one thing. In this city, land is just dirt. Blood is what matters. And you've just declared war on your own blood. My blood is fine, Jax, I said. It's yours that's looking a little thin. He didn't reply. The window rolled up, and the car sped away. leaving me in a cloud of exhaust and dust. What happened next changed the stakes of my life forever. I drove back to my apartment, my mind racing. I had the land, I had the data, I had the momentum. But as I walked into my living room, I found the door standing open. The apartment had been tossed. Not searched, destroyed. Furniture smashed, the walls spray-painted with a single word, silence. But that wasn't what made me fall to my knees. On the center of the coffee table, resting on a pile of shattered glass, was a single, silver baby rattle. The one I'd bought for Julian's unborn child just a week ago. It was crushed, twisted into an unrecognizable shape, and next to it was a photo of me and Eleanor, taken 40 years ago. Her face had been burned out with a cigar. I didn't know it yet, but Jack's vein wasn't just coming for my money. He was coming for the only thing I had left to lose. My phone rang. It was an unknown number. I answered it, my hand shaking so hard I could barely hold the device. "Hello, Elias," a voice whispered. It wasn't Jack's. It was Beatrice. Her voice was no longer silk. It was pure, unadulterated venom. "Julian is in the hospital. He had a collapse after you left. And the doctors, well, they aren't sure about the baby." "You monster," I choked out. "What did you do?" "I didn't do anything, Elias. You did. You broke his heart. You ruined his life. And now, if you want your grandson to ever see the light of day, you're going to come to the Kensington house tonight, alone. And you're going to bring that thumb drive. If you touch him, midnight, Elias. Or the Sterling line ends tonight." The line went dead. I stood in the wreckage of my apartment, the silver rattle glinting in the afternoon sun. My son was in the hospital. My unborn grandson was at risk. And the woman who had orchestrated it all was waiting for me in the house I'd built. I didn't know it yet, but rock bottom was just the beginning of my climb. And when I reached the top, I wasn't going to be holding a hammer. I was going to be holding a match. The silence in my trashed apartment felt like a physical weight, pressing the air out of my lungs. I sat on the floor, the shards of my life pricking at my skin, clutching that twisted silver rattle. It was a cruel, calculated message. Jax and Beatrice weren't just after the land or the money anymore. They were after the future. They were threatening a child who hadn't even taken its first breath, using my own son's life as the currency for their silence. I looked at the photo of Eleanor, her beautiful face scorched away by a cigar. That was the moment the last of my hesitation evaporated. I had spent 40 years building things, furniture, houses, a family, but I realized then that sometimes, to save what's left, you have to be the one who tears it all down. I didn't call the police. In a city like Charleston, a man like Jax Vane didn't just own the docks, he owned the badges. I called Harrison Montgomery. "Elias? Where are you?" Harrison's voice was sharp with worry. "I've been trying to reach you. The news is going wild with the injunction." "I'm at the apartment, or what's left of it," I said, my voice sounding like gravel. "They have Julian, and they're threatening the baby. I have to go to the Kensington house at midnight." "You can't," Harrison hissed. "It's a trap, Elias. Jax Vane doesn't do deals. He does burials." "I know. That's why I need you to do something for me. I'm sending you the files from the thumb drive. If I don't check in by 2 a.m., send them to every major news outlet and the federal prosecutor in Columbia. Don't wait for a second call." "What are you going to do?" "I'm going home, Harrison, one last time." I hung up and looked at the thumb drive. Amberly had risked everything to give me this. I didn't just make a copy. I did something a bit more old-fashioned. I went to my toolbox, the one the movers had dumped in the corner of the room. I pulled out a hollowed-out wooden mallet I'd made years ago. I tucked the real drive into the hidden compartment in the handle. On the decoy drive, the one I'd carry in my pocket, I loaded a single video file, a recording I'd made of Eleanor and Julian in the garden when he was 6 years old. If they wanted a legacy, I'd give them one they couldn't ignore. I didn't know it yet, but I was walking into a lion's den with nothing but a wooden mallet and a ghost's promise. The drive to Kensington Lane was a descent into a nightmare. The streets of Charleston were draped in a low-hanging fog that blurred the edges of the gas lanterns. When I turned onto my street, the house I had built looked like an alien fortress. The warm, inviting glow that Eleanor and I had cultivated for decades was gone, replaced by harsh, blue-white security lights that cut through the mist. I parked at the end of the driveway. My hands were steady as I gripped the steering wheel. I remembered every nail I'd driven into those floorboards. I knew which stairs creaked and which windows caught the breeze. Jax Vane might have the keys, but I had the heartbeat of that house. I walked up the porch steps. The front door, that heavy mahogany masterpiece I'd spent 6 months carving, was standing ajar. It was an invitation and a threat. As I stepped inside, the smell hit me first. It didn't smell like cedar or beeswax anymore. It smelled of expensive cloying lilies and designer chemicals. Beatrice had already begun her gutting. The wallpaper Eleanor had chosen in London was stripped away, leaving the plaster looking like raw, flayed skin. The family photos were gone, replaced by abstract, cold paintings that cost more than a year of my labor. "You're late, Elias." Beatrice's voice echoed from the top of the grand staircase. She was standing on the landing, wearing a silk robe the color of dried blood. She looked down at me with a terrifying, clinical detachment. In the shadows behind her, I saw the silhouette of Jack's vein, a cigar glowing like a dying ember in the dark. "Where is Julian?" I demanded, my voice echoing in the hollowed-out foyer. "He's upstairs, resting," Beatrice said, her heels clicking on the hardwood as she descended. "He had a bit of a panic attack when the news of your legal stunt broke. The doctor had to give him something to settle his nerves. He's very fragile right now." "And the baby?" Beatrice reached the bottom step and placed a hand on her stomach. She smiled, but the expression didn't reach her eyes. "The baby is fine, for now, but stress is a terrible thing for a pregnancy, Elias, especially when that stress is caused by a grandfather who values a few acres of dirt over his own flesh and blood." "Where's the drive?" Jax's voice came from the shadows. He stepped into the light of the chandelier, looking every bit the predator I'd seen at the ceremony. I pulled the decoy drive from my pocket and held it up. "I want to see my son first. I want to see him with my own eyes." Jax nodded to someone behind me. I felt the presence of a guard, a large man with a thick neck, stepping out from the dining room. He grabbed my shoulder and shoved me toward the stairs. We walked up to the master bedroom. The door was open. Julian was lying on the bed Eleanor and I had shared for 40 years. He looked small, his face pale and sweaty. His eyes were half open, glazed over with whatever settling medication they'd pumped into him. "Julian," I whispered, rushing to his side. He groaned, his head lolling to the side. "Dad?" "I'm here, son." "He can't hear you, Elias," Beatrice said, leaning against the doorframe. "He's in a very deep sleep, which is for the best. He shouldn't be awake for the next part of this conversation." I looked at her, and then at Jax. They weren't just protecting their investment, they were holding Julian hostage in his own mind. "The land," Jax said, his voice cold. "You're going to sign the reclamation withdrawal tonight, and you're going to give me that drive, and then you're going to leave Charleston and never look back." "And if I don't?" Jax stepped closer, the smell of expensive tobacco filling my nose. "Then Julian won't wake up. It'll be a tragic overdose. A young mogul, overwhelmed by his father's betrayal and the collapse of his company, takes his own life. And Beatrice? She'll be the grieving widow, the sole heir to the Vane Sterling fortune. She's very good at being a victim, Elias." What I didn't know then was that Beatrice's ambition had a much darker root than I'd ever imagined. "He's your husband," I hissed, looking at Beatrice. "He's the father of your child." Beatrice laughed, a sharp, brittle sound. "Husband? He was a vessel, Elias, a way to legitimize my father's assets and give us a foothold in the tech sector. And as for the child," she paused, her smile widening into something truly ghoulish. "Well, science is a wonderful thing. I didn't need Julian for that. I just needed his name." My blood ran cold. The pregnancy was real, but Julian was just a prop. They were going to kill him and raise the child as a Vane, a perfect fusion of old-world ruthlessness and new-world technology. "You're insane," I said. "I'm a Vane," she replied. "Now, the papers." Jax held out a fountain pen and a legal document. It was a total surrender. If I signed this, I'd lose the land, the trust, and any legal recourse I had. I looked at Julian's slack face, and then at the mallet I'd left downstairs in the foyer. I took the pen. My hand was shaking. "I'll sign," I said, "but I want to do it in the workshop. I want to sign it on the bench where I built this house." Jax frowned. "Why?" "Because that's where the Sterling name began," I said, projecting a broken, defeated man. "If I'm going to end it, I'm going to do it there. It's my only condition." Jax and Beatrice exchanged a look. They thought I was clinging to a pathetic bit of sentimentality. They thought I was a broken old carpenter making a final useless gesture. "Fine," Jax said. "Take him to the shop. Make it quick." The guard led me downstairs and out the back door. The air was thick with the scent of the coming rain. The workshop stood in the dark, a silent witness to 40 years of my life. As we stepped inside, the guard flipped the light switch. The familiar sight of my tools and the smell of sawdust almost broke me. My mahogany rocker, the one I'd been building for the baby, was sitting in the corner, covered in a fine layer of dust. I walked to my primary workbench. The guard stood by the door, his hand on his holster. Jax and Beatrice stayed on the porch, watching me through the windows like they were watching a play. I picked up the fountain pen and looked at the document, but my eyes weren't on the words. They were on the heavy, specialized lathe I'd installed 5 years ago, and more specifically on the industrial-strength wood glue and the solvent containers I kept beneath the bench. "Sign it," the guard barked. I leaned over the bench, my hand moving toward the paper, but instead of signing, I grabbed the heavy wooden mallet I'd left on the table earlier. "I forgot one thing," I said, looking at the guard. "What?" "I don't just build things, son. I know how to make them unstable." With a movement I hadn't known I was still capable of, I swung the mallet not at the guard, but at the structural support beam of the secondary loft I'd built for storage. I'd designed that loft to be held by a single, removable locking pin for easy cleaning, a carpenter's secret I'd never shared with anyone. The mallet struck the pin with a deafening crack. The loft, loaded with 3 tons of reclaimed oak and heavy machinery, groaned and then gave way. It collapsed in a thunderous roar of splintering wood and screeching metal. The guard didn't even have time to scream before the mass of timber buried him from the waist down, pinning him to the floor. I didn't stop to watch. I grabbed a flare gun I kept for emergencies on the boat and fired it through the workshop window, directly at the porch where Jax and Beatrice were standing. The flare exploded in a shower of red sparks, catching the dry, expensive curtains Beatrice had hung in the sunroom. "Elias!" Jax's roar of fury echoed through the yard. I bolted out the side door of the workshop, heading back toward the house. I had 3 minutes before Jax's other men arrived from the front gate. 3 minutes to get Julian out of that bedroom. I burst through the back kitchen door. The smoke from the sunroom was already beginning to fill the hallway. I ran up the stairs, my lungs burning, the adrenaline masking the ache in my joints. I reached the bedroom and grabbed Julian. He was a dead weight, but I didn't care. I threw his arm over my shoulder and practically dragged him toward the service stairs, the ones I'd built behind the master closet, hidden by a mahogany panel. Beatrice had probably never even noticed it was there. As we descended the narrow stairs, I heard the front door burst open. "Find him!" Jax's voice was hysterical. "Kill him! I don't care about the drive anymore. Burn it all." What I didn't know then was that Jax Vane had a contingency plan for a fire, and it involved more than just water. We reached the basement, the cool, damp heart of the house. I pushed Julian into the old coal cellar, a room reinforced with 2 feet of concrete that I'd converted into a wine cellar years ago. "Stay here, son," I whispered, though he couldn't hear me. "Stay quiet." I stepped back into the basement hallway, my heart hammering. I could hear footsteps above me, heavy and hurried. The house was screaming as the fire in the sunroom began to climb the walls. I looked at the main gas line, the one that fed the entire house. I knew exactly where the bypass valve was. If I turned it, I'd level the house. I'd destroy 40 years of work. I'd destroy Eleanor's spirit in those walls, but I'd also destroy the veins. My hand hovered over the iron wheel of the valve. I thought about the journals they'd burned. I thought about the photo of Eleanor with her face scorched away. I thought about my son's drugged eyes. "Elias?" I froze. The voice didn't come from upstairs. It came from the darkness of the basement corner. I turned my flashlight toward the sound. Sitting on a crate, her face smudged with soot and her eyes wide with terror, was Amberly. "Amberly? What are you doing here?" "They were going to kill me too, Mr. Sterling," she sobbed. "I've been hiding here since I left the pub. I knew about the service stairs. I saw what Beatrice did." "What did she do, Amberly?" Amberly looked up at the ceiling, her voice trembling. "She didn't just drug Julian. She's been poisoning Jax too. She doesn't want her father's legacy, Elias. She wants his empire. She's been giving him small doses of arsenic for months. Tonight was supposed to be his final heart attack. The betrayal was deeper than I'd ever imagined." Beatrice was a snake that ate its own tail. Suddenly, the basement door at the top of the stairs kicked open. A silhouette appeared, Jax Vane, clutching his chest, his face a mask of agony and rage. He was holding a gun, his hand shaking. "Elias," he gasped, stumbling down the first few steps. "Where is she? Where is that bitch?" He wasn't looking for me. He was looking for his daughter. I didn't know it yet, but the final twist wasn't about who would survive the fire. It was about who had been holding the matches from the very beginning. "She's upstairs, Jax," I said, my hand still on the gas valve. "She's waiting for you to die." Jax let out a guttural sound, a mixture of a laugh and a sob. He pointed the gun at me, but his eyes were unfocused. "She thinks she's won. She thinks the child is hers." He slumped against the railing, the gun slipping from his fingers and clattering down the stairs. "Tell her, Elias. Tell her she's a vain. And vains never get what they want." He collapsed onto the basement floor, his heart finally giving out under the combined weight of the arsenic and the stress. I looked at Amberly. I looked at the dead man on the floor, and then I looked at the ceiling as the first floor of my house began to groan under the heat of the fire. "We have to go," I said, grabbing Amberly's hand. "Now." But as we turned to reach the coal cellar, the basement door slammed shut, and the heavy iron bolt clicked into place. Through the small, reinforced glass window of the door, Beatrice's face appeared. She was smiling, her eyes reflecting the orange glow of the fire from the hallway behind her. "Goodbye, Elias," she whispered. "And thank you. You've made the clean slate so much easier." She pulled a small remote from her pocket and pressed a button. What happened next changed everything. I didn't hear an explosion. I heard a hum, a high-pitched electronic whine that vibrated through my teeth. The house wasn't just burning. It was being purged by something else entirely. The high-pitched whine vibrated through the very marrow of my bones. It wasn't just a sound, it was a physical assault. A frequency designed to scramble the senses and paralyze the will. I realized with a sickening jolt that this was the Project Void protocol Julian had bragged about during a drunken Christmas dinner 2 years ago, a proprietary security failsafe meant to protect corporate servers by incinerating everything in the room while sealing the exits with electromagnetic locks. Beatrice wasn't just burning the house. She was using Julian's own genius to erase us from existence. I collapsed to my knees, hands clamped over my ears, the world blurring into a nauseating smear of gray and orange. Beside me, Amberly was curled into a ball, screaming silently as the ultrasonic waves hammered against her skull. Even Jax's corpse seemed to vibrate on the cold concrete floor, a gruesome reminder of the fate awaiting us. I didn't know it yet, but the hum wasn't a warning, it was a countdown to a total thermal collapse. "Julian," I croaked, my voice swallowed by the wine. I crawled toward the coal cellar where my son lay. The heavy iron door was vibrating in its frame, the electronic lock glowing a steady, defiant red. Through the small viewing port, I could see Julian's chest rising and falling in slow, drug-induced rhythms. He was oblivious to the fact that his own creation was about to become his crematorium. I had to move. The heat from the floor above was already radiating through the ceiling, the ancient heart of pine beams groaning as they began to char. Beatrice thought she had won. She thought she had trapped a carpenter and an assistant in a steel box. But she had forgotten one fundamental truth about this house. I didn't just build the walls. I knew the secret passages the wood tried to hide. I dragged myself over to the main support pillar, a massive trunk of white oak I'd hauled from the Santee River myself back in '82. At its base, hidden behind a decorative copper flashing, was a manual override, not an electronic one, but a mechanical lever I'd installed in case of a hurricane-induced power failure. With a roar of effort that nearly burst my lungs, I ripped the copper shielding away. My fingers, slick with sweat and soot, found the iron handle. I pulled. Nothing happened. The frequency hummed louder, the air in the basement beginning to shimmer with the rising temperature. "Come on, Eleanor," I whispered, pressing my forehead against the cool oak. "Help me save him." I threw my entire weight into the lever. There was a sickening thunk of metal shearing against metal. For a heartbeat, the whine stopped. The red light on the coal cellar door flickered and died. The electromagnetic seal broke with a hiss of escaping ozone. I didn't waste a second. I lunged for the door, threw it open, and scooped Julian's limp body into my arms. "Amberly, the coal chute, move." She scrambled up, her eyes wide with a manic terror, and followed me toward the back of the basement. The coal chute was a narrow, steep tunnel of brick and iron that led to the side yard. It had been boarded up for 30 years, but I'd never removed the original hinges. The heat was unbearable now. The ceiling was shedding embers like glowing snow. We reached the chute, and I shoved Julian upward into the dark, cramped space. "Amberly, get behind him. Push." As they disappeared into the tunnel, I turned back for one last look at the house. The basement was a furnace. Jax Vane's body was already being claimed by the shadows of the collapsing floorboards above. 40 years of memories, 40 years of sweat and love were being reduced to ash in a matter of minutes. I climbed into the chute, the bricks scraping my shoulders, the smoke choking the life out of my throat. I pushed with every ounce of strength I had left, feeling the night air finally hit my face. We tumbled out onto the wet grass of the side yard just as the kitchen windows above us exploded in a spectacular spray of glass. We lay there in the dark, 3 broken ghosts watching the Sterling legacy burn. The orange flames licked the sky, lighting up the fog-drenched neighborhood of Kensington Lane. I looked at the house, the skeleton of it visible through the fire, and I felt something inside me snap. The grief was gone. The shock was gone. All that remained was a cold, crystalline clarity. I didn't know it yet, but rock bottom wasn't a place to stay. It was a foundation to build a new kind of weapon. 3 hours later, we were in a sterile white room at the Stuyvesant private clinic. Harrison Montgomery had pulled every string in the city to get Julian admitted under a pseudonym. My son was hooked up to a series of monitors, the charcoal filters in his system slowly scrubbing away the cocktail of sedatives Beatrice had used to bury him. I sat in a hard plastic chair, my hands bandaged, my face streaked with soot. Amberly was asleep in the corner, wrapped in a hospital blanket. Harrison stood by the window, watching the sunrise over the Atlantic. "The house is gone, Elias," Harrison said quietly. "Total loss. The fire department is still cooling the embers. They found Jax. And Beatrice? Vanished. She called in the fire herself, played the part of the hysterical wife who barely escaped. She's already moved into the Harrison Montgomery suite at the Grand Charleston Hotel. Her lawyers are already filing for emergency control of Meridian Tech, citing Julian's medical incapacity and your arsonist breakdown." I looked at my son. His eyelids fluttered. "He's waking up, Harrison." Julian's eyes opened slowly. They weren't glazed anymore. They were filled with an agonizing, sharp-edged reality. He looked at the ceiling, then at the IV in his arm, and finally his gaze settled on me. "Dad?" His voice was a dry rasp. "I'm here, Julian." He tried to sit up, but the monitors began to beep frantically. "The house. I saw it. I saw the fire. I saw her face." "I know, son, I know. She killed him," Julian whispered, tears tracking through the soot on his cheeks. "She killed her own father, and she was going to. The baby, Dad. She told me the baby isn't mine. She said I was just a genetic placeholder for the vein line." The cruelty of it hit him like a physical blow. The golden boy was gone. In his place was a man who had realized he'd sold his soul to a family of vipers for a throne made of ice. "Julian, listen to me," I said, leaning in close. "She thinks I'm dead. She thinks the thumb drive is ash. She thinks she owns the board and the city, but she forgot about your mother." I pulled the mallet from my bag, the one with the hidden compartment. I unscrewed the head and pulled out the real thumb drive. "What is that?" Julian asked. "This is the end of the Vane family, Julian. But I can't do it alone. I need the man who built the software. I need the architect to show me where the back doors are." Julian looked at the drive, then at my bandaged hands. A slow, dark determination began to settle in his eyes. He reached out and gripped my hand. His grip was weak, but his resolve was iron. "She used my code to build her cage," Julian said, his voice gaining strength. "I can use it to tear the walls down, but Dad, we have nothing left. The money is frozen. The house is ash. We have $80 million in a trust she doesn't know exists," I said. "And we have the land. She's currently sitting in a hotel that I just bought the mortgage on an hour ago through Harrison." Harrison turned from the window, a predatory smile on his face. "The E.S. Legacy Group now owns the Grand Charleston, Beatrice's personal penthouse, and the debt on her family's estate, the Willows. She thinks she's at the top of the world, but she's actually living in our guest room." The reversal had begun. For the next 48 hours, the Stuyvesant Clinic became a war room. Julian, still hooked to his IV, worked on a laptop with a fervor I'd never seen. He wasn't looking for logistics anymore. He was looking for the ghost ledgers Beatrice had used to move the Vane money. "Here," Julian muttered on the second night. "She's been using a subroutine called Cradle. It's a series of shell companies named after flowers. My mother's favorite flowers. Lilies, violets, primrose. She was mocking us, Dad. How much is in there? Nearly 200 million. Stolen from the Vane estate, siphoned from Meridian, and laundered through the plaza construction. If we trigger the void protocol on these accounts, the money doesn't just disappear, it gets routed back to the original creditors. The people Jax Vane robbed 30 years ago. Easy. Do it, I said. But not yet. I want her to feel the weight of it first. I want her to see the clutter she tried to burn come back to haunt her. On Friday morning, Beatrice Vane held a press conference in the lobby of the Grand Charleston. She was dressed in mourning black, a designer veil, a face of practiced grief. She was announcing the Vane Sterling Foundation, a charity meant to rebuild the historic soul of the city after the tragic loss of the Sterling Manor. I stood in the back of the room, wearing a charcoal suit Bella had bought for me. I looked like any other wealthy investor. Beside me stood Julian, his face hidden by a hat and sunglasses, and Amberly, who was recording every word. My husband, Julian, remains in a delicate state, Beatrice told the cameras, her voice trembling perfectly. And my father, well, the loss is too great for words, but we must look to the future. We must clear away the debris of the past to make room for the new Charleston. Is that why you poisoned your father, Beatrice? The room went deathly silent. Beatrice's head snapped toward the back of the room. The cameras swiveled. I stepped into the light, removing my hat. Beside me, Julian took off his sunglasses. The color didn't just leave Beatrice's face, it seemed to evaporate. She stepped back, her hand flying to the podium for support. Elias, Julian? You were in the house. The house has a soul, Beatrice, I said, my voice carrying to every microphone in the room. And it didn't like what you were doing to it. Julian stepped forward, his laptop open in his hand. I've just sent a little update to the Cradle subroutine, Beatrice. You might want to check your phone. The Primrose and Lily accounts? They're empty. The $200 million you siphoned is currently being transferred to the South Carolina Victims Restitution Fund. Beatrice scrambled for her phone, her fingers trembling. You can't. That's my money. That's my legacy. No, I said, walking toward her. That's the clutter. And as for this hotel, you have 2 hours to pack your bags. The new owner, E.S. Legacy, doesn't take kindly to guests who try to murder their landlords. What happened next was a masterpiece of psychological tension. Beatrice didn't scream. She didn't faint. She looked at the cameras, then at us, and her face shifted from a grieving widow to a cornered predator. You think you've won? She hissed, the microphones catching every word. You're a carpenter. You're a failed tech CEO. My family built this city. We own the soil. We own the law. Actually, Bella Sterling's voice rang out as she entered the lobby with a team of federal agents. You own a cell in the Columbia Federal Detention Center. Beatrice Vane, you are under arrest for the murder of Jax Vane, the attempted murder of Elias and Julian Sterling, and 300 counts of wire fraud and money laundering. As the agents moved in, Beatrice looked at me one last time. The mask was gone. There was only a burning black hatred. This isn't over, Elias. The Vane name is a ghost story, Beatrice, I said, leaning in so only she could hear. And I'm the one who just closed the book. As they led her away in handcuffs, the lobby erupted into chaos. Reporters were screaming questions. Cameras were flashing, but I only had eyes for my son. Julian looked at the space where Beatrice had stood, and then he looked at me. What now, Dad? I looked at the thumb drive in my hand and then at the sunrise reflecting off the glass towers of the city. Now, I said, we go to the marsh. We have a foundation to lay. And this time, we're going to build something that never cracks. I didn't know it yet, but the final twist wasn't about the money or the house. It was about a secret Eleanor had hidden in the marsh acreage that would change the history of Charleston forever. The silence that follows a great fire is different from any other kind of quiet. It's heavy, filtered through the scent of wet ash and the ghosts of things that used to be solid. 2 days after the arrest of Beatrice Vane, Julian and I sat on the tailgate of my old Ford, which was now parked at the edge of the 30-acre marshland that sat behind the ruins of our home. The Vane Sterling Plaza, the jagged tooth of glass and steel, loomed in the distance, its construction lights dark for the first time in months. It looked like a tombstone. I can't believe it's all gone, Dad, Julian said, his voice barely a whisper. He was thinner now, his expensive suit replaced by a simple hoodie and jeans I'd bought him at a local shop. He looked more like the boy who used to help me carry lumber than the mogul who'd tried to evict me. The photos, the furniture, Mom's piano. It's just dirt. Astes. I looked at my hands, the bandages white against the dark tan of my skin. A house is just a vessel, Julian. Your mother used to say that. The wine is what matters, not the bottle. But she also said that the soil keeps the secrets the walls can't hold. I reached into my pocket and pulled out the small, brass-bound compass that had been tucked inside the hidden compartment of the mallet, right next to the thumb drive. It was an old naval instrument, a Sterling family heirloom I'd thought was lost in the fire, but Eleanor had hidden it in the trust box at the bank, along with a set of coordinates written in a shorthand only a carpenter or a surveyor would understand. She wanted us to come here, I said, standing up. Not to the house, to the marsh. Julian followed me as we trekked into the high grass. The low-country marsh is a tricky place. If you don't know where to step, the pluff mud will swallow you to your knees. But I knew this land. I had walked it with my grandfather when the Sterlings were the primary builders of the Charleston docks, long before the Vanes had turned the city into their private counting house. We reached a small hummock, a dry patch of land elevated by ancient oyster shells and shaded by a sprawling live oak that looked like it had been standing since the Revolution. The coordinates stop here, I said, checking the compass. Julian looked around, confused. It's just an old tree, Dad. What could she have possibly hidden out here? Your mother didn't just invest in tech, Julian. She invested in history. She spent the last 5 years of her life working with the Charleston Historical Preservation Society. I thought it was just a hobby. I thought she was just trying to stay busy while she was sick. I knelt at the base of the oak, clearing away a layer of pine needles and mulch. My fingers brushed against something cold and hard, not stone, not wood, reinforced steel. It was a small, weather-sealed hatch, barely a foot square, buried beneath the roots. I used the silver key, the one Julian had mocked me with the day he threw me out, and turned the lock. It groaned, but it turned. Inside was a vacuum-sealed canister, and inside that canister was the true reason Eleanor had built the $80 million wall. Julian gasped as I pulled out a series of rolled parchments and a heavy leather-bound ledger. But these weren't bank statements. They were original land grants, dated 1782, and a series of modern environmental impact reports that had never been filed with the city. Dad, what is this? This, I said, my voice trembling with a mixture of awe and vindication, is proof that the Vane Sterling Plaza is built on a federally protected colonial burial ground and an endangered wetland corridor. Your mother didn't just buy the land, Julian. She had it designated as a National Heritage Sanctuary years ago. She just never recorded the final deed with the county. 1. Julian's eyes widened as he scanned the documents. If this is real, if these designations are active, then the plaza can never be finished. The city will have to condemn the building. The Vanes will be liable for hundreds of millions in environmental fines and historical desecration penalties. She didn't just build a wall, Julian, I said, looking up at the jagged silhouette of the plaza. She built a trapdoor. She knew Jax and Beatrice would try to develop this land. She let them pour their stolen millions into the foundation, knowing that the moment I produced these documents, the entire project would become a legal radioactive zone. I didn't know it yet, but the hidden truth was about to do more than just destroy a building. It was about to erase the Vane name from the history books. We spent the next 4 hours in Harrison Montgomery's private library, the documents spread out across a table that had once belonged to a governor. Harrison was pale, his hands shaking as he reviewed the colonial grants. Elias, Julian, do you realize what you have here? Harrison whispered. This isn't just a legal victory. This is a total annihilation. Beatrice didn't just move money. She bribed the former city surveyor to lose these records so she could get the building permits. That's a RICO violation on top of the murder charges. Can we move on it tonight? I asked. Tonight? Elias, the courts are closed. I don't want a court, I said. I want the Charleston Chronicle. I want the Associated Press. And I want the Vane family's remaining board members to see exactly what they've hitched their wagons to. Julian stood up, his face set in a line of grim determination. I'll handle the digital release. I can bypass the city's media firewalls. By sunrise, every investor in Meridian Tech will know they're holding shares in a company that just committed a federal crime against the United States government. As Julian worked, I sat in the shadows of the library, the weight of the last few weeks finally settling on me. I thought about the house. I thought about the workshop. I realized then that my revenge wasn't going to be about taking back the wood and the stone. It was going to be about the truth. The truth is like a dovetail joint, I told Julian as he typed. If it's built right, you can't pull it apart. But if it's a fake, the whole thing falls down the moment you put weight on it. By 3 a.m., the first headlines began to hit the wire. Sterling scandal. Plaza built on sacred ground. Vane heiress accused of historical fraud and murder. Meridian Tech shares plummet as federal investigation begins. The reversal was total. The King and Queen of Charleston were being dismantled in real time. But as the sun began to peek over the horizon, my phone buzzed. It was a call from the detention center, a restricted number. I answered it. "You think you've won, Elias?" Beatrice's voice was a jagged edge of ice. She sounded remarkably calm for a woman sitting in a cell. "You think a few dusty papers are going to stop what's coming?" "The papers are already out, Beatrice. The world knows. The world knows what you've told them," she hissed. "But you forgot about Silas Blackwood. You bought his debt, Elias. You insult his firm. And Silas doesn't care about wetlands or burial grounds. He cares about the $24 million you stole from his ledger when you accelerated that loan. I didn't steal it. I paid for it with Eleanor's trust. Silas doesn't see it that way. He sees a carpenter who got too big for his boots. He's on his way to Harrison's office right now, Elias, and he's not coming with a lawyer." My heart hammered. I looked at Harrison and Julian. We were in a private office, yes, but we were vulnerable. Silas Blackwood was the underworld king of New York finance for a reason. He didn't use the law, he used the silence. "Harrison," I said, standing up, "we have to leave. Now." But as I reached for the door, the heavy mahogany panels didn't budge. I heard the distinct click of an electronic lock being engaged from the outside. A shadow appeared through the frosted glass of the office door, a tall, lean man with a face that looked like it was carved from granite. "Silas Blackwood." "Mr. Sterling." Silas's voice boomed through the intercom system. "I've been watching your little play. Very dramatic. Very old world. But in my world, we don't care about stories, we care about the bottom line. And your family just cost me a very lucrative partnership with the Vanes." "The Vanes are murderers, Silas," Julian shouted. "Murder is just a cost of doing business, kid," Silas replied. "But disrupting the market? That's an unforgivable sin. Now, you're going to open that tablet, Julian. You're going to transfer the $80 million Sterling trust to a Blackwood account in Zurich. And then, maybe I'll let your father have a comfortable retirement in a place where the air isn't so smoky." I didn't know it yet, but this was the rock bottom I hadn't seen coming. We were trapped in a fortress of our own making, held hostage by the very man I had used to start my war. "I won't do it," Julian said, his hand hovering over the laptop. "Then your father dies first," Silas said. I heard the metallic slide of a round being chambered into a handgun. I looked at Julian. I looked at the boy who had tried to destroy me, and then at the man who was now willing to die for me. I realized that my revenge was complete, but our survival was just beginning. "Julian," I whispered, "remember the workshop. Remember the carpenter's secret." Julian looked at me, his brow furrowed. Then his eyes cleared. He remembered the collapsible loft. He remembered the hidden locking pins. He looked at the heavy floor-to-ceiling bookshelves that lined Harrison's office, the ones I had installed 10 years ago. "The pins, Dad?" he mouthed. "The pins," I nodded. As Silas Blackwood prepared to breach the door, I didn't reach for a gun. I reached for the base of the massive 3-ton oak bookshelf. What happened next changed the fate of the Sterling name forever. I wasn't just a carpenter anymore. I was an architect of destruction. The heavy oak door of Harrison's library shuddered under the force of Silas Blackwood's men. It was a masterpiece of joinery, built to withstand a century of use, but even the finest wood eventually yields to iron and intent. I looked at Julian. My son's hands were hovering over the laptop, his face a mask of sweating terror. But his eyes, those Sterling eyes, were locked onto the massive, 3-ton bookshelves I'd installed 10 years ago. "The third shelf from the left, Julian," I whispered, the sound of the door's hinges screaming as they began to warp. "The carved acanthus leaf. It's not just a decoration. It's the locking pin for the entire structural assembly." When I'd built this library for Harrison, I'd been obsessed with the idea of hidden utility. I'd designed the shelves as a modular system, held together by a single, tension-loaded iron rod that ran through the heart of the oak. It was a carpenter's trick meant to allow for easy disassembly if the building ever needed retrofitting. But tonight, it was a deadfall trap. The door burst open with a sound like a gunshot. Silas Blackwood stepped into the room, followed by 2 men with the cold, dead eyes of career predators. Silas didn't look like a man about to commit a murder. He looked like a man checking a balance sheet. He held a suppressed pistol with a casual, practiced ease. "Time's up, Elias," Silas said, the hum of the city lights behind him casting his face in jagged shadows. "Transfer the trust, now. My patience is an asset I've already fully depreciated. You don't want to do this, Silas, I said, stepping in front of Julian. I felt the vibration of the floorboards. I knew every joist in this building. I knew exactly where to stand. The money is already moving. The feds are on their way. You're walking into a tomb. Silas laughed, a dry, rattling sound. The feds are busy at the hotel processing Beatrice. I own the local precinct, and I have a private jet idling at the airfield. By the time anyone looks at this room, you'll be a tragic headline about a family dispute that turned violent. Now, Julian. The password. Julian looked at me. I gave a slight, microscopic nod. Okay, Julian said, his voice trembling as he reached for the keyboard. I'm entering the authorization code, but the system requires a physical biometric override from the primary trustee. Elias, Silas barked, gesturing with the gun. Move, now. I walked toward the laptop, but I didn't go directly to the desk. I grazed the edge of the third bookshelf. My fingers found the carved acanthus leaf, a piece of wood I'd spent 40 hours perfecting. I felt the hidden spring beneath the grain. You know, Silas, I said, my voice dropping to a low, resonant tone that seemed to vibrate in the quiet room. The problem with men like you is that you only see the surface of things. You see a shelf, and you think it's just a place to put books. You see a house, and you think it's just equity. You never stop to ask how it's held together. Enough talk, Silas hissed, stepping into the center of the room, right into the kill zone I'd calculated a decade ago. I pressed the leaf. There was no loud bang, just a soft, mechanical snick, followed by a sound like 1,000 dry bones snapping at once. The tension rod, under 3 tons of pressure, sheared. The interlocking oak shelves, designed to support their own weight through gravity and friction alone, suddenly became a cascading wall of timber and heavy leather-bound volumes. The entire left wall of the library didn't just fall, it exploded outward in a domino effect. Silas's men were buried instantly under a mountain of law books and heavy mahogany. Silas himself tried to dive for the door, but the overhead header beam, the one I'd left floating on a decorative corbel, gave way as the shelves collapsed. He was pinned to the floor by a 1,000-pound piece of white oak, the gun skittering across the marble toward Julian's feet. The room was filled with the smell of old paper and pulverized wood. For a moment, there was only the sound of Silas groaning and the distant wail of sirens. I didn't know it yet, but the final secret was about to come from the laptop. Julian was still clutching. Julian didn't pick up the gun. He didn't run. He stared at the screen, his face turning a ghostly, translucent white. Dad, the transfer. It's not going to Zurich. What are you talking about? I asked, limping over to him, my breath coming in ragged gasps. The Stuyvesant card, the legacy trust. It wasn't just money, Dad. Look at the transaction history. Every time Mom moved $1, it was being mirrored by another account, an account registered to the Department of Justice Asset Forfeiture Division. My heart stopped. I looked at the screen. Eleanor hadn't just been an investor. She hadn't just been a guardian. She had been an informant. The realization hit me like a physical blow. Eleanor had known about Jack's vein smuggling for 30 years. She had been building the Legacy Trust as a massive digital honeypot. Every cent she earned was actually being tracked and tagged to build a federal racketeering case that spanned 4 decades. She had been waiting for the moment the veins became desperate enough to touch that money. She wasn't hiding it from us to protect us, Julian whispered, tears streaming down his face. She was hiding it because she was the one who was going to take them down. She just didn't live long enough to see the trap snap shut. The sirens were louder now. Blue and red lights began to dance against the library walls. The heavy mahogany doors burst open, but it wasn't local police. It was a tactical team in FBI vests, led by the same agents who had taken Beatrice. "Don't move!" they shouted, but their weapons were trained on Silas and his buried men, not us. Agent Porter, the woman from the detention center, stepped into the room. She looked at the wreckage of the library and then at me. She didn't look surprised. "Mr. Sterling," she said, holstering her sidearm, "we've been monitoring the Stuyvesant beacon since you activated the card in that motel. Your wife, Eleanor, she was the best deep cover financial asset we ever had in this district. She told us that if the day ever came that you used that card, it meant the veins had finally moved for the land. She told us to follow the Carpenter and he'd lead us to the hoard." I sank into a chair, the weight of the last 40 years finally lifting. Eleanor hadn't been knitting. She had been weaving a net. She had loved me enough to give me a life of peace, but she had been brave enough to ensure that the people who threatened that peace would eventually pay the price. "The plaza?" I asked. "Condemned as of 20 minutes ago," Porter said. "The federal historical designation is valid. The Vane assets are being seized under the Kingpin Act. And Julian," she looked at my son, "because you cooperated and provided the cradle ledgers, the U.S. attorney is willing to discuss a full immunity deal. You were a pawn, but you were the pawn that checked the king." The aftermath was a blur of depositions, legal filings, and the slow, methodical dismantling of the Vane empire. Beatrice Vane is currently serving a life sentence in a federal facility in West Virginia, her clean slate reduced to a 4x8 concrete cell. The child she claimed was her legacy was never born. The pregnancy had been another one of her elaborate fabrications, a psychological ploy to bind Julian to her family. Meridian Tech Group went through a structured bankruptcy, but Julian was allowed to retain the core software patents. He didn't try to be a mogul again. Instead, he used the remaining funds to establish the Elias Sterling Foundation for Environmental Justice. 6 months later, the dust had finally settled. I stood on the marsh acreage, the sun setting behind the live oak where I'd found the hatch. The ruins of the Kensington house had been cleared away. I didn't rebuild it. I didn't want a mansion anymore. Instead, I'd built a small, modest cottage and a state-of-the-art workshop on the edge of the sanctuary land. It was made of reclaimed timber from the plaza's demolition, a bit of poetic justice I took great pride in. The door to the workshop opened, and Julian stepped out, his face smudged with sawdust, a chisel in his hand. He'd been apprenticing under me for 4 months. He wasn't fast, and he still struggled with the patience required for a perfect joint, but he was learning. He was learning that a man's value isn't in his bank account, but in the things his hands can create. "Dad," he said, holding up a piece of walnut, "I think I finally got the dovetails right on the cradle for the museum exhibit." I walked over and inspected his work. It wasn't perfect. It was a little tight on the left side, and the grain didn't perfectly align. But it was honest. It was solid. It was a sterling piece. "Measure twice, cut once, son," I said, clapping him on the shoulder. "I know, Dad. I'm getting there." We stood there for a moment, looking out over the marsh. The Vane Sterling Plaza was being dismantled floor by floor, a jagged skeleton of greed being slowly erased from the skyline. In its place, the marsh was already beginning to heal. The birds were returning. The pluff mud was reclaiming its territory. I looked at my hands weathered, scarred, and strong. I realized that my revenge wasn't the collapse of a building or the imprisonment of a woman. My revenge was the fact that I was still standing, and that my son was standing beside me, finally understanding the weight of the wood. A house can burn. Money can be seized. But a foundation built on truth and the love of a woman like Eleanor, that's the only thing in this world that never cracks. I've heard plenty of stories about family betrayal. I've seen fathers and sons torn apart by the hunger for more. But here is the subtle moral of the Sterling story. You can't build a life on a foundation of lies and expect it to hold up when the storm comes. If you want something to last, whether it's a chair, a house, or a relationship, you have to start with the best materials. You have to honor the grain, and you have to be willing to tear it all down if you realize you've built it on sand. Eleanor was the smartest person I ever knew. She knew that greed is just a fire that eventually runs out of fuel. But integrity? Integrity is the wood that just keeps getting harder with age. What are you building today? And more importantly, what are you willing to do to protect the foundation of the people you love? Share your thoughts in the comments. And if you've ever had to lose everything to find out what really matters, subscribe and tell your story. Because sometimes, the only way to see the horizon is to let the walls burn down.